The smell of antiseptic was still in my hair when they wheeled me out. 4 days. That's how long I'd been in St. Michael's. And 4 days was apparently long enough for my husband to forget how to look at me like I mattered. "Nathaniel?" I said, shifting Audrey against my chest, her little fist curled against the hospital blanket they let us keep. "Aren't we taking the car?" He didn't turn around right away. He was looking at his phone the way he always looked at his phone now, like it owed him an answer to something. "I need the car tonight. My parents' anniversary dinner, remember? Mom's been planning it for weeks." I remember. Of course I remembered. I'd had it circled on the calendar in the kitchen for a month, back when I still thought I'd be there, sitting between his mother and his sister, smiling through the speeches about how Nathaniel had grown into such a fine man. "There's a bus stop 2 blocks from the hospital," he said. "The 506 goes straight to King Street. You'll be home in 20 minutes. I thought he was joking. I actually laughed, this small disbelieving sound, because surely a man does not say something like that to his wife who is 4 days out from a C-section, who is holding his daughter, who has a staple line under her shirt that pulls every time she breathes wrong. Surely. He wasn't joking. "It's October, Nathaniel. She's 4 days old. She's bundled up. You're being dramatic." He was already walking, his coat collar turned up against the wind coming off the lake, car keys jingling in his hand. Our car, the dark blue Audi my father had given us as a wedding gift 2 years ago, registered in my name because that's how my father did things, quietly, without making a fuss about it, sat in the parking garage 2 floors up. I knew because I'd watched the valet bring it around that morning, when he picked me and Audrey up to take us. I'd assumed, home. I stood there on the curb with my daughter for a long moment, the cold finding every gap in my cardigan, and something in me went very still and very quiet. The way water goes still right before it freezes. I didn't argue. I want to be honest about that, because for a long time after, I was ashamed of how easily I let it happen. But I'd learned, somewhere in the 18 months since our wedding, that arguing with Nathaniel Cole only ever ended with me apologizing for things I hadn't done. So I tucked Audrey deeper into the blanket, found the bus stop, and waited 40 extra minutes in the wind because the 506 was running late on a Saturday. A woman at the stop, older, kind-faced, took one look at us and gave me her seat without being asked. "Newborn?" she said. I nodded. She didn't say anything else, just reached over and tucked the blanket a little higher around Audrey's ear, the way someone does when they've raised babies of their own and can't help themselves. I could have cried right there on the bus. I didn't. I'd gotten good at not crying in front of strangers. By the time I got home, our apartment, the one on the 9th floor with the view of the harbor that Nathaniel liked to mention to people at parties. There was nothing in the fridge except a carton of orange juice and a jar of pickles. I hadn't expected him to have shopped. I'd stopped expecting things like that around the time I realized his mother had never once asked how I was feeling. Only ever asked when I was getting back to myself, as though pregnancy were an illness with a recovery timeline she found personally inconvenient. I called my sister Ren, because I needed someone to bring me soup. And because Ren was the only person who still looked at me like I was someone worth checking on. She came within the hour, took one look at me sitting on the kitchen floor because it hurt too much to climb onto a bar stool, and didn't say "I told you so," even though she had told me so, more than once. Back when I was choosing the dress and the venue, and the version of my life I thought I wanted. "You could call Dad," Ren said quietly, stirring the soup she'd brought. "I'm not calling Dad. I want to explain why because it matters. My father is Desmond Whitfield, though almost nobody outside the family calls him that anymore. Not since the company went public. Not since his name started appearing in places I never wanted it to appear. He built Whitfield Marine Logistics from 2 boats and a dock in Halifax into something that moves a significant share of the freight along the eastern seaboard. He is, by any measure people care about, a wealthy man. I am, by extension, a wealthy man's daughter. And when I met Nathaniel at a friend's engagement party 3 years ago, I did something my father warned me never to do, and my mother understood completely. I told him my last name was Whitfield, and let him assume it meant nothing. The way Smith does thing. I let him think I worked the front desk at a marketing firm, because I did work the front desk at a marketing firm. I just hadn't mentioned that I owned 11% of it. I wanted, just once, to be loved for something other than what I came with. For the first year, I almost believed it had worked. Nathaniel was attentive, funny in that dry way that made me laugh at his jokes weeks later in the shower. He noticed when I was tired. He brought home the wrong flowers on purpose, because he knew it would make me laugh harder than the right ones. I married him in a small ceremony my father quietly funded and never once mentioned, because I'd begged him not to make it a spectacle, not to let Nathaniel see the size of what he'd actually married into. Somewhere in the second year, the noticing stopped. I told myself it was the new job, the long hours building his startup, the stress. I made excuses the way you make excuses for weather, as though his coldness were simply a season I had to wait out. Audrey didn't change that. If anything, she made it worse. Nathaniel had wanted a son, had said so more than once in the offhand way men say things they think are harmless. And when Audrey arrived 4 days early and entirely herself, something in his face shut like a door. His mother, Patricia, and his sister Diane came by the apartment exactly twice in those first 2 weeks. Both times they brought hand-me-down baby clothes that smelled faintly of someone else's cedar closet and spent the visit discussing, in front of me, whether my people, that was the word Patricia used, my people, would be sending anything for the baby. It would be nice, she said, not quite looking at me, if her family contributed something. Nathaniel's been carrying so much. I sat there with Audrey on my chest and said nothing, because I had learned that silence cost me less than the truth would. Nathaniel was carrying, as far as I could tell, a salary from a company my father's old business partner had quietly helped seed 2 years earlier, a fact Nathaniel did not know and never would, because I had asked Dad not to interfere, and Dad, to his enormous credit and my enormous regret, had respected that. 2 weeks after Audrey was born, I called my mother's old friend Priya, a postpartum doula who'd helped half the women in Ren's mom group, and asked her to come by twice a week, paying her out of an account Nathaniel didn't know I had. He noticed Priya's car in the parking garage exactly once. "Who's that?" he said, not really asking. "A friend helping with Audrey. We don't need to be paying someone for that. My mother offered. Your mother offered to count my husband's overtime hours out loud at the dinner table, I thought, and said nothing. The morning everything changed started ordinarily enough, which I've noticed is how the worst mornings always start. Audrey had finally slept 4 hours straight, and I'd slept maybe 3 of them. And I was standing at the kitchen counter eating toast over the sink when Nathaniel came out of the bedroom already dressed for work, looking at his phone the way he always looked at his phone. "My mom and Diane are coming by Thursday," he said. "Try to have the place looking decent, and maybe don't have Audrey in that thing." He gestured vaguely at the baby carrier hanging by the door, a beautiful soft-structured one Priya had recommended, the kind that costs what it costs because it actually supports a newborn's spine properly. "It looks cheap." It had cost $400. I didn't say that. Cheap how? I don't know. Just, get something nicer if people are coming over. We don't want them thinking we can't. He stopped himself, but I understood the rest of the sentence anyway. We don't want them thinking we can't afford better, when the truth, the actual unbearable truth, was that I could have bought the hospital we'd just left. He left for work without saying goodbye to either of us. I stood at the counter with cold toast in my hand and felt for the first time in 18 months something other than sadness. It was quieter than anger. It felt almost like clarity. Thursday came. Patricia and Diane arrived at exactly 6, which gave them 45 minutes to inspect the apartment before Nathaniel got home from work. A window of time I'd come to recognize as their preferred operating hours, when they could say things to me they wouldn't say in front of him. "Is this all you're feeding her?" Patricia said, peering at Audrey's bottle on the counter, though Audrey was, in fact, exclusively breastfed and the bottle held expressed milk for the overnight feed Priya was helping with. "It's breast milk," I said. Patricia said it the way she said most things to me, a single syllable doing the work of an entire paragraph of disapproval. Diane wandered the apartment with the particular nosiness of someone pricing furniture in her head, picking up the small framed photo on the bookshelf. Me and my father at the company's 20th anniversary. Taken 4 years ago, before the company name had grown large enough that strangers recognized it. "Who's this?" Diane asked, turning the frame toward me. "My dad. He looks important." She said it lightly, almost as a joke, the way you'd say it about a stranger in a photograph. And I realized with something close to relief that she truly had no idea. None of them did. In 18 months, not one of them had bothered to look. They had decided, the very first time they met me, what kind of woman married into good families by accident? A pretty receptionist who'd gotten lucky, and they had simply never revised the opinion, because revising it would have required them to wonder, even briefly, whether they owed me something they hadn't given. Nathaniel came home at 7:30, smelling faintly of the steakhouse 2 blocks from his office, the one I knew he liked because the partners took clients there, and he'd mentioned it more than once with a kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. He hadn't eaten with us. He hadn't called to say he wouldn't be home for dinner. He sat down at the table, as though he'd simply walked in from another room, and Patricia immediately brightened, the whole evening reorganizing itself around his arrival, The way a room reorganizes itself around the person who's actually expected to be there. We were just admiring the photo of your father-in-law, Diane said to him, smiling. Quite the distinguished man. Nathaniel glanced at the frame without much interest. Yeah, I haven't met him yet, actually. Busy guy, I guess. There was something in the way he said it. Busy guy, I guess. That told me exactly how little thought he'd given to the fact that in 18 months of marriage, my own father had never once been invited to his table, while his mother sat in my kitchen judging my breast milk twice a week. I excused myself to feed Audrey in the other room, and through the wall I heard Patricia's voice drop into the register she used, for things she didn't want me to hear clearly, but wanted me to hear enough of. Something about how lucky I was, really, that Nathaniel had been willing to take on a girl with no family behind her, no real prospects of her own, and Nathaniel's voice, low, tired, not disagreeing. I sat in the nursery with my daughter at my breast, and I felt the last soft, foolish, hopeful part of me. The part that had kept waiting for the man I married to come back, go very quiet. The way a light goes out not with a flicker, but all at once. I didn't make a scene that night. I want you to understand that about me, because I know some people, hearing this story, expect the moment of fury, the door slammed, the suitcase thrown. That wasn't me. I'd spent 18 months learning to be very small in my own home, and you don't undo that kind of training in a single evening. What I did instead was wait until Patricia and Diane left at 9, wait until Nathaniel was asleep, and sit at the kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of chamomile tea, and quietly, calmly, begin making calls the next morning that had nothing to do with him at all. The first call was to my father. Hi, Dad Petal. That's what he's called me since I was small, for no reason either of us can remember anymore. How's my granddaughter? She's perfect. My voice cracked a little, the first crack in 18 months of careful composure, and my father, who has negotiated shipping contracts with men twice his size and never once raised his voice doing it, went very quiet on the other end of the line. The particular quiet of a man listening for something underneath what's being said. What's wrong, Petal? I told him. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. The bus, the cold, the bottle, the photograph, the word cheap. I heard something shift in him as I talked. A stillness settling over the line that I recognized from childhood. From the handful of times I'd seen him truly, quietly furious, which was always far more frightening than any shouting could have been. You don't have to do anything, I said quickly, because I knew my father and I knew the particular machinery that started moving in him when someone he loved had been hurt. I just needed to tell you. I know I don't have to, he said. I'm asking what you want. And that was the question, wasn't it? Not what he wanted to do to Nathaniel, not what Ren wanted, not what anyone else in my life thought I should want. What did I want? I thought about it for 3 days. I thought about it while Priya helped me ease the swelling in my ankles, while I watched Audrey's eyes track the mobile above her crib for the first time, while Nathaniel came and went from the apartment, like a man boarding at a hotel I found slightly beneath him. And on the 4th day, I called my father back. I want him to know who he married, I said. Not because I want his money or his apology. I want him to understand completely and finally the size of what he threw away, so that he never gets to tell himself a story afterward where I was the lucky one. My father was quiet for a moment. That's not a small thing to want, I know. All right, Petal. Tell me what you need. What I needed, it turned out, was simpler than I'd expected. I didn't need lawyers, not yet. I needed a date. My father's eldest brother, my Uncle Graham, was being honored by the Halifax Board of Trade the following month. A black-tie dinner that the city's business pages would cover. The kind of event where the Whitfield name would be spoken aloud, repeatedly, by people who mattered to people like Nathaniel. I needed an invitation sent formally to Mr. and Mrs. Nathaniel Cole, through channels Nathaniel would recognize as significant. Engraved, delivered by courier, the kind of thing that makes us sit up straighter at his own kitchen table. It arrived on a Tuesday. I watched Nathaniel turn it over in his hands at the counter, reading the heavy cardstock twice. Whitfield, he said slowly. Like the shipping Whitfields? Yes, I said. Like them. How do you? Why would they invite us? I looked at him for a long moment, my daughter asleep against my shoulder, and I felt something settle in my chest that wasn't triumph, exactly. It was closer to grief. Grief for the marriage I'd actually wanted. The one where none of this would have mattered at all because he would have loved me before he knew any of it. Because Graham Whitfield is my uncle, I said, and Desmond Whitfield is my father. I watched the color leave his face in stages, the way weather moves across open water, and I want to be honest and say there was a part of me, small and unkind and entirely human, that enjoyed watching him do the math. The apartment, the car, the wedding he'd thought was modest. The photograph on the bookshelf his sister had picked up and put down without a second glance. The daughter he'd called a disappointment for not being a son. Now, apparently the granddaughter of a man whose name moved freight up and down an entire coastline. You let me think, he started. I let you decide what you thought, I said. I never lied to you, Nathaniel. I told you my name. I told you where I worked. You simply never found me interesting enough to ask a second question. He didn't come to the dinner. I went with Audrey, 6 weeks old by then, in a dress my mother had quietly made, and I stood beside my father in a room full of people who had known me my entire life, who picked Audrey up and exclaimed over her the way family is supposed to, and for the first time since the hospital curtain, I felt the cold finally leave my chest. Nathaniel moved out 3 weeks later. He didn't fight for the apartment because the apartment, like the car, like nearly everything else, had never actually been his. My father's lawyer, a soft-spoken woman named Imelda, who has handled the family's affairs for 20 years, made sure of that quietly, the way my father did everything, without fanfare, without revenge dressed up as righteousness, just the slow, complete unwinding of a man's assumptions about what he'd married into and what he was therefore owed. Patricia called me once after, her voice gone strange and conciliatory in a way I'd never heard from her. We didn't know, she said. If we'd known, I know you didn't know, I said. That's rather the point. I think about that bus stop sometimes, the wind, the kind stranger who tucked the blanket around my daughter's ear without being asked, more gently than my own husband had managed in 18 months. I think about how close I came to believing that was simply what I deserved. Audrey is 8 months old now. She has my father's laugh, which is a strange and wonderful thing to watch develop in a person so small. We live 10 minutes from Wren, in a house with a yard that backs onto a ravine, where the maples are about to turn. And some mornings I stand at the window with Audrey on my hip, and I think about the version of me who stood shivering at that bus stop, and I forgive her, because she didn't know yet what I know now, that you cannot make someone love you by hiding the parts of yourself that frighten them. You can only wait, patiently, for the truth to do what it was always going to do, which is exactly what it's for.